Hey everyone, welcome to part 4 of antscan data, sculpting ants. So, just a quick recap. For the past few weeks, I have been doing a one second. Let me bring up the website. I remember how to use the web. Okay. So past few weeks I've been using scan data from antscan. This is extremely high quality insect scan data created through high throughput synchrotron micro CT. So this is the kind of scan that requires a particle accelerator to do. So very hard to actually create these scans, but what's awesome is antscan is a project that has put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of high quality scans of ants online, and they are hoping to do even more insects in the future. So these are all free to download. You can free to download them in the STL format. So you just go to antscan.info right here, click on this button right here, it'll take you to the Biomedisa website, and then you can scroll down, find the ant that you want, pay attention to the species, but also the caste. So you'll find some queens in here, some workers, some minims, and other various different types of ants. Here is one with, oh, this is a male ant, so this one actually has wings. So if you click on this, you get to see the actual slices created by the scanning process. And some information. You go down here, and you can download the STL format and bring that right into ZBrush. And that's what I've been doing for the past few weeks. If you go to my website, bloopatone.com, and click on CG instruction, I've created an archive of all my previous live streams. So if you want to go see the first 3 episodes, the links are right here from the past few weeks. And then I also have links to, these are all in order so you don't have to dig around in the YouTube, Maxon YouTube channel, because it can be kind of hard to find all the different live streams. A lot of great stuff up there, but if you weren't looking for my live streams, I put them all on my website right here, and I'm adding to this archive with some older stuff as well. So check that out. And what I'm going to do today, so if we take a look at the project, we started with this. Here's my original scan data. So you can see it's all kind of crumpled up. And then what I did is I started splitting the pieces into different subtools, and then creating, using Z-remeshing and other techniques, sort of symmetrical low poly versions. So I've got the head there, and I haven't really worked on this too much, but these are the mouth parts, mandibles, and antenna, and then I have the thorax down here. So here's the original scan of the thorax, and then these are the pieces kind of broken out into different subtools and kind of cleaned up. You can see they're perfectly symmetrical, so I'm going to work on making them less symmetrical. So here's the petiole, and the abdomen down here. Here's the original abdomen, and then I've been working on making this into different pieces right here. So the idea is to make this into something that we could rig and animate, or 3D print. But just basically I want to make it symmetrical and kind of pose it in a style that makes it easier for rigging. So last week I did the legs. So these are the original legs. And then these are my retopologized symmetrical version right here. So you see, I haven't put in the detail yet, but that's the fun part, and that's what we're going to start working on today. And I'm going to start with the head, because that's always the fun part. That's where a lot of the personality is, right? So there's a couple challenges with this, nothing too drastic. All the sort of difficult part has been done. This is more the fun part. If we take a look at the original head, we can see that the detail is not symmetrical. It's almost symmetrical. It's kind of symmetrical, but it's not perfectly symmetrical. And that's what makes it interesting and more realistic. If we make perfectly symmetrical details, it's going to look very artificial. But at the same time, I wanted to create a perfectly symmetrical mesh, because that'll make it easier to create things like UVs and that kind of stuff. Excuse me for a second. I'm going to turn down my music. Listening to some good old-fashioned Renaissance music while I work. So, no problem. What we could do is we could use projection to do this. Let me turn off this. And one thing we can do is, let's take the original head here, and I'm going to duplicate it, and then just flip the duplicate horizontally. So go down to deformation, and let's flip on the x-axis, right? So now we have one for each side. So then what I can do is I'll take my head right here, and I'm going to mask off part of it. Right, one side, and I'm going to hide everything, but to turn off the solo, we can see this is what it looks like. So I'm going to take, actually what I want to do is let's take this head, I'm going to clear that mask real quick, and let's bring it up to a higher subdivision level. So this one is about 3.5 million points. I'm going to bring it down maybe to subdivision 4. And I'm going to just store a morph target right here. Excuse me. Allergy season as I destroy my keyboard. Could store a morph target. That's probably the easiest thing to do. Could also use layers, but I'm going to store a morph target just on the subdivision level, and then mask this. Whoops. Let's do project all. Got some detail right there, and then I'm going to clear the mask, or sorry, invert the mask by control clicking, and then I'll turn on this guy. And of course my entire system has failed because I basically made a symmetrical version of the model. I didn't need to reverse this head. Duh. Sorry. Brain's not working. Let's go back. There we go. Flipping that head like that was kind of a dumb thing to do. Let's undo that, undo that. What can I say? Not enough coffee today. There we go. Much better. Now we have asymmetrical detail. Okay. Now I'm probably going to create the eyes as separate geometry. So I'll just kind of leave them be for the moment. You can just smooth away some of this this stuff around here, and then we're going to smooth away some of the projection errors. I'm going to sort of refine the details of the sculpting, regular sculpting tools. So I'm going to just go in here and do this. And of course, that's also where we stored a morph target, so if anything's really messed up, we can just use the morph brush to clean it up. I feel like flipping the head before projecting it was kind of like failing an IQ test, but I guarantee if I took one of them cognitive tests, I would ace it, because I know the difference between a camel and an elephant. Usually the first or second guess, I can get it. I'm just going to lower the Z intensity of my smooth brush and just kind of just do a quick once over here just to clean up any artifacts. This down here we can use the morph brush on. Morph right there. The other thing I need to do is let's see if we can find some good photographic reference for this. Using the morph brush in the back here to clean this stuff up a little bit. Okay, so what I need, of course, so okay, so we got some images here. Okay, let's see. Ugh. Probably doesn't like it because I'm recording. So I'm going to pull up our good friend PureRef. And load some images in here. This is kind of typical. It's hard, you know, for a very specific species of ant, it's not always easy to find really high resolution images. These aren't bad from AntWiki. These can be quite helpful, especially when you're doing like the coloring and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's kind of typical, very low resolution. Well, that'll give us in the ballpark. All right, so I'm just going to have that off to the side here. Then what I'm going to do is go down to geometry. I'm just going to delete my higher levels of subdivision and then subdivide again. And let's see, we'll get some of my favorite brushes. So go to the user tab of the Lightbox, and I'm using a lot of the same brushes that Tomas Wittelsbach uses. This TW cloth brush is a nice one for detailing. I'm going to bring down the focal shift, the draw size. You just go in here and kind of just bump up these details a little bit, and adding a little, you know, I'm going nice and loose because I want them to look organic. I don't want these to look like mechanical, sterile CG ant. I want this to be very believable. So the goal is to create a realistic ant here. So if I do a nice render of it, people will think it's a photograph. And I say, why don't you just take a picture of it? And I'll be like, well, because I like sculpting ants. I'm using the little remote control thing that comes with my Cintiq because I kind of messed up my arm. I've been sculpting like this for a long time with the keyboard, and it's kind of messed up my shoulder, so trying not to do that, but of course I have to get used to where the buttons are on this thing. Usually I find that with detailing at first is a little bit slow, and then it kind of gets faster as you kind of figure out how you want to make the details. And once you get the technique down, it goes a little bit faster. I'm trying to make this accurate, so I'm not going to just do like random stuff. Not too much random stuff, a little bit of randomness, obviously. But for the main details, I want to follow the scan as much as possible. But you know, smoothing it and then sculpting this back in kind of can help to remove some of the projection noise and sort of the pixelation from the scan. So, and then you can add your own sort of style to it. Another thing you can do is go back to this version. Okay, yeah, so this is the antenna right here. So I start to lose sight of what's going on here. One thing I can do is, let's see. Another way to have reference directly on the screen is just to literally drop a copy of the model in the background, so you can see how everything fits together. So I'm going to press Shift S, and that drops a copy onto the canvas, and then I can go back to this one, solo. Thank you. And that way I can remind myself of how these things fit together. So So another brush that I like to use is clay tubes. So let me bring that out. I'm just kind of digging in here because this is where the antenna is going to fit in. This is one of those things. It's like when if you're designing a creature or an alien or something like that, you want an insectoid look. You know, one of the cool things about insects is when you see they have these grooves and little slots, just like robots, where pieces fit together and they can fit tightly. So you have a groove here where the antenna actually comes out of and fits in. And bring the strength of my smooth brush up again. It's especially true with beetles. If you look at beetles, especially the underside of beetles, beetles are a lot harder to sculpt than a lot of people realize. It's a great exercise, especially if you like your brain doing somersaults, to go and do to work on some beetles. One of my favorites that I worked on a few years ago was the rainbow scarab beetle. It was a very hard model to do, but a fun challenge. I just did it for myself. It wasn't for a client or anything. But yeah, I was very proud with how it came out. But man, I'll tell you what, the underside of that thing was very difficult to sort of wrap my head around. I had to get a specimen and put it under a microscope and just pull it apart and stare at it. It's a little bit gross. So it looks like right here, what we can do is go shifty. See your density on this a little bit. Hello, thanks for joining today. I wonder if you have any questions about what I'm doing. just invented something there. Got carried away. Let's see right here. There's a little bit of a shelf in there, actually. I am from the United States, but I'm living and working in France. So I'm in La Rochelle. It's a very beautiful city, right next to the ocean. Yeah, where are you watching from? Since you asked. This is an ant, so that's going to be Hymenoptera, right? Ants are Hymenoptera because they've evolved from wasps, right? Hymenoptera, of course. Hello from India. Thanks for joining. Hymenoptera is interesting because the reason it's called, the order is called Hymenoptera is because between the front wings, the back edge of the front wings and the front edge of the hind wings, there's like a little Velcro mechanism, these little hooks that go along the wings, and they kind of hook together when the wings are in flight to create basically one wing out of the two wings, right? So this would be one wing, as opposed to dragonfly wings, which are like this, right? And then when they are not flying, they can detach and fold. So ants are in Hymenoptera, and you're thinking, well, that's crazy. Ants don't have wings, but ants do have wings. The queen has wings, and the males have wings. The queen loses her wings, and well, the males don't live very long. And as I said, the ants evolved, have a common ancestor with wasps. Spicomyrma is the species that was discovered in amber that is the so-called link between ants and wasps. It's interesting because all ants are eusocial, and only some wasps are eusocial. You have wasps, you have solitary wasps, parasitoid wasps, and social wasps, and all kinds of combinations, whereas ants are all social. They're various degrees of sociality, but they still are all eusocial creatures, meaning they're a superorganism, so the entire nest acts as a single organism, which I find really fascinating. I work as a freelancer, so done some work for Filmograph recently. Just posted some of the stuff I did on the One Piece logos. I do a lot of scientific modeling for various museums. I work for CDM Studios Perth in Australia, various other, I'm inventing stuff again. Various other studios and that kind of stuff. Most of the industry these days is freelance because that's just the way it is. It doesn't really make a huge deal if I invent a little bit of these details, but I like to, just for the sake of staying as close to the reference as possible, keeping this true to the original scan. Any tips for a new freelancer? Biggest tips, if you're new to the industry, here's what I would suggest, because the industry is always up and down. Right now we're in a very down phase. Not a lot of work, and it's global. It's everywhere. Why? I don't know. It has to do with the economy, technology, etc. There's still work being done because movies are coming out, but I just don't know who's doing them. But what I would say is when you're starting out as a freelancer, make sure you have you can do more than one thing. You got to have range, because you can't count on, like, if you're a really amazing character sculptor, that's great, but you're only going to be working when they need an amazing character sculptor. And so you're going to be limited. Of course, if you're too much of a generalist, you can spread your skill set too thin, and then it's a jack of all trades problem where you're pretty good at some things, but you don't necessarily have enough strengths. So what I usually do, or what I did early on, was, pick 3 complementary skills and focus on those. So, for example, a good example would be modeling and texturing, right? Because if you are a good modeler, then, and a good texturer, then you can texture your own models and make them look good. It's also their complementary skills, as opposed to being a really good modeler and, say, an effects artist, like really good at explosions and stuff. Those are very different. It's a very different skill set. And it's not bad. I mean, I used to do effects stuff like particles and all that kind of thing back in Maya before Houdini completely took over. So pick like 3 skills, like modeling, maybe texturing, maybe rendering. That way you can render your beautifully textured models. If you were into animation, then I would say, like, learn rigging and animation, because those are complementary skills. So just so enough so that if you're working at a studio, the last thing a studio really wants to do is go out and have to hire new people if they don't want to. And it doesn't matter. I'm talking, this is true for freelancers as well. If you're like, I've been doing jobs for Filmograph for like 20 years now. Well, maybe 15. But I've known the guys. I've worked with the guys when we were Prologue Films in Hollywood for many years. So they kind of know my skill set, and when they have a need for it, they call me up. Now, I was a generalist, so I did effects stuff, I did animation stuff, I did modeling. My favorite, of course, is ZBrush. Sculpting is my favorite thing to do. But if you're just starting out, that's what I would suggest. Is find 3 complementary skills and practice them and hone them and keep your portfolio up to date with examples of that. And I would also say, I'm a myrmecologist at heart. I really answer one of my favorite insects. Sorry, I just switched topics there because of a question real quick. But I really do like ants a lot. My favorite right now are probably bees, but I got into ants because I was reading a lot of E.O. Wilson. I did some work for E.O. Wilson back in the day, and so that got me really into ants. But anyway, so yeah, get those 3 complementary skills together and make sure that you have range in your portfolio. You're not going to get a lot of work if all you can do is like robots or orcs or hulks, right? You want to show that you can do range. Difficult thing about being a character sculptor. Another complementary skill for modeling would be grooming, doing fur and that kind of stuff, because that's a very useful skill to have. But if you're a character artist, you can't just do Vikings all the time. You're going to have to learn some fashion. You're going to have to get some copies of Vogue magazine and learn how hairstyles work, how to apply makeup. And if you're a manly man, that's going to be an interesting transition for you. It's something I kind of figured out, because when I started out, I really wanted to be a character artist. But as you can tell from looking at me, I'm not exactly the most fashion-forward person in the world. And I realized if I was going to be a good character artist and have work, I'm going to have to learn about fashion and makeup. So I switched to creatures. Creatures is my favorite thing to work on. I still like doing characters, but I don't know that I would necessarily go out for top-level character gigs because of that, because of my lack of knowledge in those areas. But as far as the myrmecology question goes, I do have friends who are actual myrmecologists. I know Alex Wild. I did some photography workshops with him. I know some fly specialists like Brian Brown at the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History. And Lisa Gonzalez and Emily Hartop are fly scientists. And I know dragonfly experts and some spider experts. Thomas Shahan is an expert on jumping spiders. John and Kendra Abbott, they're dragonfly specialists. So it's always nice to have these people to call up when you want to have your model critiqued for accuracy. But scientists, most scientists are nice, but sometimes their critiques can be quite brutal. But it's just because, they stare at these things under microscopes. If you're the kind of person who actually has to identify new species, then you're going to really know the minutia of insect anatomy, because sometimes it comes down to like the difference between two species of flies might be the number of hairs on their genitals or something like that. Not as obvious as you might think. The other advice I would give to anybody starting out or anybody working in the industry is, your biggest strength next to your skill set is going to be the people that you know and your reputation. Your reputation is the most important thing. And it's easy to screw up a reputation. I've done it a few times. It basically, when the key to screwing up your reputation is letting your ego get out of control. You have a few good gigs, you do something neat for a movie, next thing you know, you think you're a superstar, and you start to get a bit of an attitude. Nobody really likes to work with people with attitude. It becomes a real drag when somebody's a self-proclaimed genius or something like that. So you had to be careful. Be careful who you diss. Try not to badmouth people, because word gets around. And you have to be a professional. It's this work. If you're doing it as a hobby, you can do whatever you want. Say whatever you want. Create a YouTube channel and diss all the people that you want. But if you're going to be a professional, you're really going to keep that stuff under control. Like I said, there's been a few times where I thought I was pretty good at keeping my reputation and my ego in check, where things got out of hand, I got a little bit of an attitude, and so some of those people, they don't call me anymore, and it's a real shame because I liked working with them. It happens, So you really have to be careful about that kind of stuff. The other thing I would say is stay on top of the new tools, including AI. As much as you might hate AI, it's not going away anytime soon. So there's a lot of YouTube channels that are predicting the death of AI and everything, but that's just not the case. Maybe generative AI, maybe the stuff that AI slop might go away, which would be wonderful, because I don't like AI slop any more than anybody else. But AI tools in filmmaking and games and animation, they are not going to go away. So it's a good idea to learn them, to at least learn enough about them to have an intelligent conversation at the very least. Because AI is not going to take your job away. What's going to take your job away is people who know about how to use AI, whether you like it or not. So be aware of that. So when I started doing CG, it was in like the late 90s, believe it or not, and it was interesting because at the time there were all these articles coming out, in the news, popular news. It's like, oh, this guy who used to work for Disney Animation is now working at McDonald's or driving a taxi or whatever, and he lost his job because he's a traditional animator, and all the studios are using computers now, and he didn't want to learn the computers. And I always thought to myself, it's like, that's ridiculous, because if you're a trained animator and you've been working in the industry in like Disney films or whatever, you already have the hard part done. You already know the animation, the art of animation. That's the hardest skill to acquire. Why wouldn't you learn the computer stuff? Why would you sit there and say, I refuse to do it because I don't want a computer taking my job? It's not taking your job. Computer artists are taking your job, animators. So I don't know why, you can't afford to be a Luddite in this industry. What do we do when someone expects us to finish a fully polished, semi-realistic character with retopo clothes accessories in 4 to 5 days? Okay. Your first option is to say that's not possible because, and I've been in this situation before, and it sucks because you really don't want to disappoint somebody. You want to prove that you can do it, and at first you're going to say, "Oh, I feel like I can do it," in your brain. But the problem is that's not taking into account the fact that there's going to be issues that come along the way. Client's not going to like something. Client's going to want some changes. You could do a fully realistic character with clothes if you bust your butt within 4 to 5 days. But what happens when the client comes back and says, "Oh, I didn't mean a sweater. I meant like a hoodie." Well, how long is it going to take to fix that? So the client who's asking you to do it in 4 to 5 days is not being realistic, or they're trying to take advantage of you, unless they can provide exactly what they want. So your options are basically to be realistic and say you're not going to get high quality within that time frame, or I can do it, but I'm going to charge you a lot of money. Because it's just. I mean, I know really high-end character artists like Mark DeDecker is a really great character artist, and he's been in the industry forever. And I know he's worked at some places where they were like push him to that kind of level, and it's just not possible. It's ridiculous. If you really want a high-quality character, something that can be rigged and animated and used in any meaningful way. If you want a concept model where you don't care about the topology and it's not meant to be animated, it's just a 3D concept, yeah, maybe then. If they provide you with scan data, then yeah, that helps. Anything that helps may speed up the process, whether it's meta character, meta humans or something like that, or character creator. But still, the problem is the client's going to come back and decide that they want changes, and that's what they're not factoring into 4 to 5 days. So I had a gig like that just last year, where I had some. It started out with, "Oh, you have some spider models that we'd love to use for this animation." Like, "Oh yeah, I can provide that. That's no problem." And then before I knew it, I was remodeling, re-rigging, redoing the fur, animating, and rendering, all within a ridiculously short amount of time, and I ended up pulling all-nighters. It was a miserable experience, and it didn't come out nearly as good as it could have been. This person just didn't know what they wanted, or was not realistic. They didn't even provide storyboards, so I had to make this stuff up, and it was very, very difficult. Not fun at all. And that kind of stuff does happen. It's unfortunate when it does. And of course, on top of all this, they still owe me money. So, Max on ZBrush, ban this account. Sailor tap 3. Okay, I'm not going to pay attention to that. Okay, I see what you're saying. All right. So I don't know what to tell you. It's tough because you don't want to, especially right now, given the market, the way the market is. It's really not a whole lot of fun to discourage somebody from hiring you. But at the same time, if it ends up being a miserable experience and you end up doing low quality work as a result, then it's not benefiting anyone. So you just have to be as honest as possible and say, we can try to get it within 4 to 5 days, but most likely if you have any changes, that's going to add to the timeline. And the other thing you can do, if possible, if you're a freelancer and you have a contract, is you can specify in your contract that you're going to do a certain number of changes. Like, let's say, okay, I'll give you the model plus 2 rounds of changes for X price or X hourly rate, or however you want to do it. But beyond that, if there's further changes, then we're going to have to do, I'm going to have to charge you an additional for that, because that's basically where a lot of the pain comes in with all the changes. Like I said, on the project I was working on, it started out, they also wanted a butterfly, and I modeled the butterfly, And they're like, no, we meant a female of the species, not the male. I went, okay. So I went back and redid it, made it into a female, which is not an insignificant amount of work. Took about a day. We start working on the animations. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I modeled a female. They said they wanted a male. And I started working on animation. And I'm working on the animation, and the storyboard says the butterfly lays some eggs. I'm like, guys, the male butterfly is not going to be laying eggs. That's what the female does. Oh, sorry. I missed that part of the storyboard. Can we go back to the female? So I wasted, a whole day's worth of work, made a very nice male butterfly that ended up not being used because they weren't really paying attention. So that's the kind of stuff that can really bite you in the butt if they have a short timeline and they're not paying attention. Look at this. I'm probably spending too much time being picky with these details, but it's fun. So I'm going to press Control N. That clears off that copy on the back of the screen. Let's save this, right? I'm going to switch it up a little bit, just work on the eyes, just so I have a little bit of a variety here, so I'm not just drawing lines all day. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to a lower, I have it down here. Let's get that clay tubes. I'm just going to push this back in. I like to create the eyes with separate geometry so that I have enough geometry to support the lenses, because insect eyes have compound eyes, so they have lots and lots of lenses. I think it's one of the coolest parts of insects, and I always hate when I see somebody does an insectoid model or creature and they kind of cheap out on the eyes. They just do like a little grid or just some whatever. The eyes have it. The eyes are the mirror to the soul. And insects have a lot of souls. They got a lot of lenses. So I like to create with separate geometry, and then I can also create separate UVs for the eyes, and it ends up looking better. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push these back. And then what I could do, oops, and see the little eye holes are slightly different sizes. These should be a bit more symmetrical. Move that up a little bit. Here's what I'm going to do. I am going to turn off solo, switch over to this subtool. You can see I think the eye has been pushed in this one a little bit on both sides. So there's our scan data. So you can see that these are fairly low resolution eyes as insect eyes go. You compare them to like a dragonfly or something like that. Okay, what if humans had eyes like insects? Would it have been better? That's a wonderful question. I did a whole animation on insect eyes because it's something that I found really interesting. Insects' vision is very, very low quality. Every organism has several senses that are more powerful than others. For human beings, our eyes are very sensitive. It's one of our primary senses, right? As opposed to like our sense of smell, which is not very sensitive. And so you have all these different lenses, and basically, a human eye, we have one lens on the front that focuses the light on the back of the eye, right? Which is a retina, which is covered with all these different cells, right? So you have all these cells back here, beam of light comes through the lens, hits that, and creates the image. Insects are almost like the reverse, right? They have all these lenses right here, which are called ommatidia. Each one is like a little tube, right? And the light goes down and focuses. So instead of having a retina, all their cells are out here. So you can actually see the resolution. This is pretty low. If you have something like, 10,000 to 20,000 ommatidia for an insect, for an eye, that's not that much compared to like a retina. Insects, especially ants, their primary sense is their chemoreceptors. In other words, their sense of smell. They're covered in hairs, and these hairs and their antennae especially are very sensitive to chemical compounds that come in contact with the hairs, and that's how they sense their world. They're smelling their way through the world. So insect eyes are not very good compared to human eyes. So I don't think it would be better if human eyes. It's a really cool book that just focuses on evolution just on eyes, because eyes, or light receptors, have evolved many different times throughout the course of evolution. In other words, there's been many routes that eyes have taken over the time. They're basically photosensitive cells that have developed over time into our eyes. So, in insect eyes, they can't rotate them around the way that we can. They're pretty much stuck with the light that comes into those cells. So I'll show you real quick, since you asked. If you go to entomologyanimated.com. So this is a project that I started a few years ago, which I'm sad. Whoops. Oh, there it is. Okay, Entomology Animated. And I did a 4-part series on insect eyes, comparing ants with fireflies and praying mantises and bees and that kind of stuff. So if you're really curious, they're short. Each animation is like 3 or 4 minutes long, but packed with cool animations and information and stuff. So. And these are all models that I created in ZBrush. So anyways, you can check that out if you want more information. I do actually a comparison in the 4th chapter with human eyes versus insect eyes. So for example, I was talking about field of vision. So like a bee has a wider field of vision. You did ask, so I'm answering, than humans do. But they also have lower resolution, and they can't see as many colors, but they can also see ultraviolet light. So it's a very interesting topic. So check that out if you're curious. Okay, back to eyes, the sculpting of eyes. I'm glad my advice was helpful to you. Everybody gets discouraged every once in a while. It happens. It's normal. And there's only so many things that you can control. You certainly can't control the stock market or the world events or the development of new technologies. The best thing you can do is just roll with it and, focus on those things that really get you passionate. Use those as a guide, but don't limit yourself to just doing. If you really, really like the Hulk, don't spend all your time just doing Hulks unless you're a hobbyist, because that's not a good way to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to append let's append a star. Okay. Append a star. And I'm going to go W, and let's make this polycube. And we'll divide it, Control D. So we want a polycube. What we're going to do, actually, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do polycube, but let's make sure that it only has one division. There we go, that's better. And let's get it to like right here. So let's do like right here. So we really only need about half of this, so I'm going to delete half. Yeah, I've been kind of obsessed with insects for for the past 15 years or whatever. I just find them really fascinating. If you can see, I don't know if you can see back here, I have a picture of a fly. This is a species of fly that was named after me because of some help that I did with some scientists on a project. So that's so I'm very excited. I always brag about it because, hey man, I got a species of fly named after me. But there's always more to learn. If I hang out with a bunch of entomologists, I feel like I don't know anything. Okay, what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to go to UV master, and I'm actually going to create some UVs for this really quick. Don't need symmetry. And if we go down to UV map and morph UV, you can see this is what the UVs look like. So I want UVs because I'm going to use Noisemaker to create the Omatidia. And so then what I'm going to do is, let's rename this, we'll call it I. And I'm just going to move it up here. And let's bring it into place. Is there an insect that completely defies what we thought we knew about biology? I would say like all the time. That's why we have entomologists. There are some rules that all insects follow. As far as we know, from all the insects that we studied, going way back to the 19th century when it started to become really in vogue to study insects in depth. With Darwin was obsessed with beetles and so on, and Bates with butterflies. Insects all have 6 legs in their adult phase. They all have compound eyes or no eyes. Sometimes they have compound eyes with only a few lenses, or maybe with like a very small cluster of eyes, but they still all have compound eyes. They have segmented bodies, exoskeletons. Sometimes this exoskeleton can be soft and squishy, like in the fly abdomen. Some ants, like the honeypot ant, has a very squishy, flexible body, but it's still an exoskeleton. But some of the interesting things that we find out is like, so one of the guys who worked on the antscan project is a scientist named Thomas van de Kamp. He's a German guy, really cool guy, really nice guy. And when he started doing this, he was a biologist who basically started hanging out with physicists. And in doing so, he ended up getting access to a particle accelerator in Europe. And that's how he started to develop this technique of scanning using a particle accelerator. Because it also scans the inside of the insect. And so with a very, very high degree of accuracy, much more than you can get even with like a CT scan or something like that. And so in the process, he was doing weevils. And he discovered through the scans that the weevils on their joints and on their legs, they like to pull their legs in. Insects are very try to keep moisture out of their body as much as possible, because moisture is a avenue for infection, right? So they want to keep their bodies watertight as much as possible. And so the weevil has this weird corkscrew mechanism, so it can screw its arm in, or its leg rather, very, very tight to its body, making it watertight. And this corkscrew thing, it looks so mechanical, it looks like something you'd see in like IKEA furniture or something like that. So that was like a new discovery made recently just from doing 3D scans. And that there's stuff like that all the time that happens. And then there's the whole concept of social insects is really fascinating. And that's something that evolutionary biologists are constantly arguing with. Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson famously got in big fights about the origins of social behavior in ants. But yeah, there's... I'm trying to think of other ones. I mean, there's just a lot of them. I don't think there's any insects that have done... they do a lot. There's a lot of wild things about insects. There's even insects that in a way sort of feed their young through kind of a milking process, which is kind of bizarre. It doesn't necessarily make them mammals, but it's very interesting. But I don't know if there's any insects that's completely gone way outside what we know about typical insects. But then again, that threshold of knowledge expands every single day. That's the whole point of science, It always makes me laugh when I see an article. It's just like, well, what scientists got wrong? It's like scientists are always getting things wrong because they're always trying to discover and refine what they know. So I've worked with a lot of scientists, and the main drive of a scientist, a good scientist, is not ego, I am right. Although there are plenty of scientists with big egos, don't get me wrong about that. A lot of big ego scientists. But the main drive behind a scientist is curiosity. It's not necessarily that they want to prove that they're right, even though they might think that they are. But for a good scientist, they're always curious. And so they're always looking to, if they come up with a good, solid theory or an idea, they work very hard to try and disprove it, because they know if they don't, other scientists will. So if you can't disprove something, if all other avenues have been failed, then chances are your idea might be right. But then again, it's based on what we know, what we can discover. I don't know if that makes any sense. But if you're writing a scientist character for science fiction, then your character is not very curious. It's not a believable scientist. It's not a good scientist anyways. Okay. So I have this eye basically kind of in position. So what I'm going to do now is I have UVs on it. So now I can subdivide it. So I'm going to get it up there. So now it's about 3 million polygons. For this particular insect, that's probably good enough. Then we want to create our hexagon pattern. So I'm going to go down here to surface and turn on noise. And we can go to this wacky interface. And this is sort of the default noise right here. So I'm going to set this to UV since I have UVs. So you can see that changes the direction the noise is being projected from. And then I'm going to go to the noise plugin and find hex tile. Turn on hex tile, and you can see the hexagon right here. So let's bring the mortar, the thickness down. So you can see it's getting thinner there. Let's bring the size down. I think something like around here is going to be okay. So So I'll choose OK. We can change it again if we need to. I'm going to set the mix basic noise to 0 so we don't have our basic noise in there. Let's choose OK for now. And let's turn off solo just to compare it with the size, our lumpies here. So it could be a little bit bigger, I think. So go back in here and let's up the plugin scale just a little bit. Let's do plugin scale. I think that will probably be good. Yeah, that looks about right. Okay, so now that I've got that, I'm going to go in here and choose mask by noise. So you can see there's a mask now. And I'm going to hide the mask, Control H, just because I like to. And go down here to deformation and bring up inflate. Maybe not that much. I'm going to undo that. If I click on this little slider here a couple times, alright, sometimes you can get the second slider to appear, or you just type in a value. Let's try 0.1. 0.5. Let's look at that's good. Let's do one more. 0.5. And then I'll just hit it with a smooth brush. You get a nice insect eye that way. It's not the only way to do it, but it works pretty well. I mean, for this one, we have the smaller helmetidea right down here, but that's okay. It does occur in some insects, probably not ants. You can also go over here with the inflate brush and bring it down to a really low value, like 1. Can AI help identify new species? Yeah, I definitely can. And then some of the scanning technologies that are being used, like the AI is helping to do that. Also, AI is also helping to take the scans and also kind of figure out the parts. Doing what I'm doing manually, AI is getting better and better at doing. Which you're like, oh, well, that's a shame because I like sculpting insects. Well, there are millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of insects out there, so there's a lot of insects to scan and create libraries from. So there's still going to be work for that kind of thing. Personally, I like doing it just because I like doing bugs, you know. So there's lots of different, you know. The other thing about the AI is definitely help. You know, you need with a scientist to work with the AI to look at all the different parts and do comparisons, because essentially traditionally when a scientist is out in the field, they have something that's known as a key. A key is just a book, and basically if I'm looking at an insect through a microscope, I look at the key. It says this insect has, you know, 2 wings and 2 long legs and 1 pair of short legs. And so you flip to the page, you see all the insects that fit that description. It's like, okay, it has those things, but it also has very short antennae. Okay, so I look in, and so you just kind of drill down through the key until you can narrow it down to either discovering that you found an example of an existing species, or you found one that has some characteristic that's not part of the key, and then chances are you've discovered a new species. Hopefully you can find other representations that have similar qualities and so on. It's very laborious work, and when I worked on Bioscan, or when I didn't work on Bioscan. What I did is I offered a part of my backyard in Los Angeles so the scientists could collect bugs, and they did this through a bunch of different families throughout the entire Los Angeles region, and they managed to discover something like 30 species that are new to science in the process, and there were about 30 families that volunteered using their backyard for the project, and so as a sort of thank you, they named the species after the families that participated. So that's how I got a bug named after me. So as you can see, all of this involves a lot of laborious work and comparison and digging through existing research and comparisons. Those are all things that AI is good at and can be trained at. So when those things happen, then AI can help make that process a lot faster. But the other thing it can do is it can also, if you know, oh, cool. Yeah, please share your final result for the insect scan. That'd be great. There's a scientist named Neil Shubin who's really interesting. He wrote a great book called Your Inner Fish. There's also a movie based off of it. It's really good. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he was trying to discover, he had a theory of it, trying to figure out when our wrist joints evolved, right? Where that came from in terms of sea creatures evolving to becoming land creatures. And so the way he did this is he didn't just go out in the field and look at fossils. That was a later stage. He did do that, but before he did that, he used all the existing research to narrow down where would be the most likely place that they could find this existing species. And this is years of research to do this. And of course, they finally located a fairly remote island in Canada, where it was the most likely place that they would find this fossil. They went there, they looked with experienced fossil hunters, and they researched for weeks and weeks and weeks in the winter, and then lo and behold, they finally found an example. They named the fossil Tiktaalik. So it shows you that doing research can also predict where's the most likely place that you're going to find evidence of a species, or perhaps a new species. Something also that AI can help with, processing a lot of data and saying you're more likely to find a new species or species new to science of wasp in this particular part of the jungle in this country or whatever. AI could, I think I could see AI helping with that quite a bit. So there's lots of different things. I mean, there's also protein structures and that kind of thing that AI is helping with. That gets a little bit more esoteric, I think. Okay, so I want to duplicate this eye over to the other side. So I'm going to first save this. I'll do that. And then I'm going to use Z plugin subtool master. This is a great way to copy one object to the other side. Subtool master. The reason this is a good way to do it is because it can keep the subdivision levels as it mirrors. And the options are, I'm going to use the x-axis. I like to do append as new subtool just in case something goes wrong. Then I could just merge the two subtools if that works. So let's give this a try. So we'll say OK. It's giving me a warning. So now we have is updating the subdivision levels. And there we go. Okay, are you done? Still updating. I don't know why this is taking so long. Normally this is a faster process. It's only 3 million polygons, guys. Come on. How are insects reacting to global warming? Oh, that's a really good question. There's some good examples that are not very encouraging. You know, there are some insects that basically go dormant in the winter and the cool months. And these insects are often the kinds that are very damaging to trees and forests. Well, as the earth warms, of course, then their period of dormancy is shortened, and now they have more time to destroy more of the trees, which of course creates a feedback loop because you have fewer trees, you have fewer ways to suck up carbon dioxide and produce oxygen and that kind of thing, which of course leads into a positive feedback loop, which makes global warming worse. So that's a huge concern about these particular insects that are it's a type of beetle, I believe. That's one way. Of course, you also have tropical insects like mosquitoes that carry diseases like dengue fever and malaria and all that kind of stuff. Well, as the Earth gets warmer, they are starting to migrate further and further north, which means they're coming into contact with human beings who live in the north and spreading disease. So that's not a good way. There's also a lot of negative aspects of pesticides. We've been using pesticides for like 100 years now on a really wide scale. So people are starting to notice that there's fewer and fewer bugs out. You drive across country, you get fewer bugs splattered on your windshield, which means there are fewer bugs out there. But that's also disturbing. But there's lots and lots of other ways that insects are either the behavior of insects that we don't like is becoming worse because of global warming, or the beneficial insects that we do like, they could be negatively impacted as well. Loss of habitat is the most frequent. That's not necessarily climate change, but that's a big one. I have a friend in Los Angeles who is I think he was also an ant guy, who was studying sort of the ways that urban environments, less forestries and that kind of stuff, increase global warming, and how that has an impact on insects and that kind of stuff. So you've been using ZBrush for a week and a half now. You're enjoying it? I don't know what's going on, why this is taking so long. It's very strange. I only did the one subtool, right? Maybe it's a masking thing. Maybe I left the mask on, and that's causing a problem. All right, we'll give it a few more seconds here. Okay. Did it work? Oh, that's interesting. It merged it into one subtool. I thought that I had... I left merge onto one subtool on. That's why it took so long. But at least it worked, so what are you going to do? I don't want to do it again. This eye is a little bit out of place, but that's okay. We can fix that on our model. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. I'd rather have the eyes symmetrical in terms of their placement and their size because of rigging and that kind of thing. So if we have to adjust our model a little bit to take care of that, that's okay. So what I'll do is I'll just play with that a little bit now. And if one superpower from an insect, what would it be? Another good question. Well, it's hard to argue against the power of flight. That's a good one. But it's also fairly obvious. And the biggest superpower that ants have is ants are what's known as a superorganism, which I always find really fascinating. So what that means is basically the individual ant is not really considered the organism. It's the colony that's considered the organism. So if you're like a Star Trek fan, the Next Generation, the Borg was modeled after ants. And because of this, they're able to do an astonishing amount of work because they're working together. And I mentioned this last week. A lot of people think that the queen is in charge of the colony. It's not really the queen that's in charge of the colony. There is no individual each ant is like an individual cell in your brain. Individual cell in your brain isn't doing a whole lot. Put them together with the neural network and all the connections you have, then suddenly you have a very powerful organ. So you can kind of think of each ant as being like an individual neuron in a giant brain. So in the history of cell biology, right, you have single-celled organisms which dominated life early on in the history of life on Earth, and then eventually you had multicellular organisms. And what changed, how did we suddenly get multicellular organisms? Well, it started because of a interesting symbiosis between bacteria and archaea. So bacteria swallowed another microorganism, single-celled organism called an archaea, and this archaea, rather than becoming lunch, had a symbiotic or a relationship with that bacteria. And it became kind of like the power cell for that cell, giving it enough energy to start to, the cell was able to start to differentiate, in other words, creating different organelles within the cell. And this individual organism, or this symbiotic organism, became what's known as the mitochondria, which you have in each one of your cells. So as a cell was able to generate more energy and become more powerful, it was also able to start to form colonies. So when you have colonies forming of individual single-celled organisms, they form a multicellular organism. And so now you have an organism like us, metazoan, made up of all these different single cells, right? It's a very powerful thing. Well, social organisms like ants are the next step beyond that. Now you have multicellular organisms, individual ants, that are forming a colony that is becoming a superorganism in itself. That's pretty cool. That's why ants and wasps and bees are so fascinating, because of their ability to do this. So that's a superpower I always find very interesting. There's a whole branch of biology called sociobiology that was founded by E.O. Wilson based on this concept of the superorganism. And then, science fiction is borrowed from that idea. Like I said, the Borg in Star Trek kind of sort of tried to do it. I think they kind of screwed it up, though, when they had the episode where Hugh ended up becoming friends with Geordi, and I don't know. But, what are you going to do? The Borg before Hugh came along was a little bit of a boring alien because of its limitation of being a completely, a completely social organism. The xenomorph, of course, in Alien was based off of wasps, parasitoid wasps. That's another example of just a little bit of entomological knowledge turning into an entire sci-fi franchise. If you look at tarantula hawk wasps, which are really scary giant wasps, have the second most painful sting in the animal kingdom. They use this sting to paralyze tarantulas, and they drag the tarantula, still alive but paralyzed, back to their nest, and they implant eggs into the tarantula. The tarantula is paralyzed but still alive, and the eggs hatch inside and eat their way out, just like the alien in Aliens, the xenomorph. Pretty gruesome, man. Nature's brutal. Okay, so you can see we have some eyes. The eyes are very neat and tidy, which I think is okay. It's a little, when I was first starting to do insects, I came up with all sorts of different ways to do eyes, and this is the way that I found was yielded the best results consistently. Like I said, there are other ways to do it these days. Like Pablo has some really great insect brushes, including some insect eye brushes. But when you're sculpting them directly, it can be really hard to get them kind of consistent. If you want something that's kind of wonky, then you can sculpt each lens individually, and that'll look pretty good. But if you want something that's kind of neat, because I could always take this and make it a little bit more organic. Of course, I just screwed up my symmetry on this, but that's okay. What's the most extreme adaptation you've ever seen in an insect? Extreme is a lot of different ways to put it. One of my favorites, though, is an orchid bee. That's the one that I use for my cover on the startup. So, oops, that's one I used to use in my cover in my startup. Let's see if I can find it on my website. I think orchid bees are really beautiful. They're one of my favorite bees. These guys, these gals right here. So this is a model I did of an orchid bee, and what's extreme about it is the proboscis, because it's actually longer than the bee itself. Yeah, you can see right there. That's how long it is. I think that's pretty extreme. And they're also just beautiful. Bees are just really wonderful in the way that their legs function, because each pair of legs has a different function for the bee, especially honeybees. I do like honeybees quite a bit. Another one is that's really cool is, let me see, this is an old model. It's not really a great model, but it's still kind of cool. Let's see if we can find it in here somewhere. Oh, I always like the this is a rainbow scarab beetle. These guys are just wild. They're just really beautiful. This is like the underside. This was really hard to sculpt because of the shapes are so wild. Oh, these guys right here. Like I said, this is a model that I started but never quite finished. But these guys are wild. These are little beetles, and they fold up perfectly into a ball. And modeling this was a real challenge because it's like, do you model it closed or you model it open? I got, most of the way done, but it needs a lot of work. The real thing is quite much more impressive than my model. But I actually got, they're very cute too. I actually got some of these in the mail from a scientist. That's what they look like when they're balled up. They're little samurais. And they're really hard to open. I had to soak it in hot water for hours before it would open up. This is a dead one. And then, of course, the minute the water cooled, it shriveled up again. So that was a really difficult model to do. But it's a fun one. I think that's pretty extreme. Mosquitoes are extreme. Nobody likes mosquitoes. Even the scientists that study mosquitoes. Most scientists who study insects will develop a fondness for their chosen species. People really love ants. Alex Wilde loves ants, doesn't care about anything about it. It's not an ant. Butterfly people love butterflies. Spider people love spiders. Nobody likes mosquitoes. I run into mosquito scientists and they're like, yeah, we hate them. Not all mosquitoes, of course, are the ones that carry disease or feed on humans. It's only a few species that do that, but still, they're enough to ruin it for everybody. Another type of insect that most people hate is cockroaches, and that I can understand. I don't like cockroaches very much, but specifically the cockroaches that infest your house. There are very beautiful cockroaches that live in the jungle. Madagascar hissing cockroaches are cool. There's actually some cockroaches that are downright adorable. They look like anime characters. So they're not all bad. I think I mentioned this last week with there's a species of fly that's pretty extreme. They're called ant decapitating flies, and they lay their eggs in a living ant in between the tergites. So the spaces between the plates, and these eggs will they're laid on a abdomen or something like that, and as the eggs develop inside the ant, they make their way all the way up to the head, and then they once they hatch, the ant's head falls off and the fly crawls out of it and flies away. That's pretty extreme. That's even worse than the xenomorph, I think. But as a defense, the ants leafcutter ants have developed a special caste of ants in the part of the colony, really small versions that just ride on the larger ants and fight off the ant decapitating flies. That's really extreme stuff. Look up these guys right here's a picture of a little baby fly crawling out of an ant's head. Pretty gross, huh? There's a good example. And what's funny is, of course, well, funny not if you're an ant, but when the head pops off, it'll crawl around the head by itself for a little while because the little ant fly is trying to get out of it. So yeah, those are extreme. You can see the ants will fight off those flies, and you can see there's probably a picture in here somewhere. You should be able to find a picture of a smaller ant riding on a larger ant, and the smaller ant's job is just to fend off these flies. It's pretty wild. Let me see. Okay, I'll have to look it up. I don't know that particular species. Oh, a parasite that infect this snail and make this snail's eyes pulsate. I don't know that one, so that's a cool one. Yet another reason why I don't eat escargot. That's pretty wild. Wild. No, I didn't know that. That one. You also have pseudoscorpions, which are an arachnid. They're not an insect, and they just hitch rides on flying insects. That's pretty cool. There are insects that basically wear the dead bodies of other insects on their bodies as camouflage. It's kind of gruesome. Or what they'll do is there's beetles that'll cover itself with like garbage and stuff, but then there's also these insects that'll wander around with like a head of an ant still attached to its leg. If it has survived the ant attack, which is kind of cool. Let's get up to the higher superficial levels here. So I'm just kind of bringing some of this stuff out real quickly here. That's interesting. So this insect infests the snail, takes a hold of their brain, and makes them climb to the top of a leaf, and makes their eyes pulsate so birds eat them, and the cycle continues. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, it's like the cordyceps fungus convinces ants to keep climbing higher and higher and higher, so that when the cordyceps sprout, they can release their spores. And that's, I guess, the whole inspiration for Last of Us, right? Just like a little bit of a biology, and you have yourself a science fiction masterpiece. Which evolutionary innovation do you think was more crucial for insect success, flight or complete metamorphosis? I think the most successful has been eusocial behavior, because ants are basically the most successful insect. If you took all the ants in the world and weighed their mass, they'd come out to the same mass as if you took all the humans in the world and weighed their mass. They're one of the most successful predators. There's a really great movie you can watch on YouTube called Ants, Nature's Secret Power. It's an old movie, but it's a really good one. I think that if you're going to judge, it's hard to judge what is success, In evolution, success is basically stuff that works until it doesn't work anymore. You know what I mean? Extinction means that it doesn't work anymore. Evolution basically, evolution always ends as the extinction. So it depends on how you define success. But in my opinion, flight is useful depending on where the insect lives and how the flight is used. Like I say, ants use flight in a very limited way. The queen uses flight when she's making her virgin mating. When a virgin queen leaves the colony to establish a new colony and goes out, mates with a bunch of ants. This is the example I'm using is like a fire ant, and then it goes to find a suitable place to form a colony. It loses it. She loses her wings. She literally eats the wings. She finds a suitable place to start the colony. She starts laying eggs immediately. The first brood is the smaller workers that basically their job is to set up the colony. And so that's what they start doing right away. And they're setting up the colony so that the next generation of eggs can become the workers, the main part of the colony. And then you have like leaf cutters that are highly specialized within the colony, all these different types of workers within the colony. And the leaf cutters are actually, they cut the leaves, they bring the leaves back to the nest, they plant the leaves, and then they feed off the fungus that grows on the leaves. So there's a symbiosis between the ant and the fungus, and also the bacteria that they use as a fungicide to keep away the bad fungus. So there's like almost every branch of life is part of this superorganism, the leafcutter colony. I always find that really fascinating. But this is all enabled through social behavior. And then, of course, ant colonies, an individual ant colony can get huge, spanning miles or kilometers, depending on which you prefer. Like in the United States, there are these massive super colonies of fire ants that almost span an entire state. And it's like you had, in South America is where the original Solenopsis invicta came from. They actually invaded the United States in like the 1940s. They came over on a boat by accident. And And then they kind of took over the South because they didn't have their natural predators to keep them in check. And then what happened is they evolved, typically an ant colony will have one queen. Virgin queens will leave and form a new colony. But an ant colony has one queen. Well, some ants in the South, in the United States, probably other parts of the world too, but definitely in the South, have evolved to tolerate more than one queen. So you have these massive sprawling colonies that have more than one queen. For some really weird reason, the process is known as Gamergate, which is the exact same name that they used for the scandal a few years ago within the gaming community. It has no relationship. I don't know why. Yes, I'm making an ant. This is based off of scan data. So this is my original scan right here. Check off of antscan, and I'm in the process of, this is, a scan, so it's all shriveled up. I'm in the process of cleaning it up and making something that could be rigged and animated. So I've been working on this for the past 4 weeks or so. So if you're curious, you can go back and see some of the older episodes to see how I started the process. Okay. I got about 15 minutes left today, but as I was mentioning, go to my website, bloopatone.com. Under CG instruction, I have links to the previous episodes, as well as my other live streams. Yeah, this is week 4, so I'm just doing the detailing now. Mostly what I'm doing today is talking, though, but I'm doing detailing. I've already cleaned up and separated the models and made it into symmetrical geometry, so now I'm taking the projected details and just kind of refining them and making them look a bit better, which is my favorite part of the process. And I'll probably, next week, I'll work on the thorax and the abdomen. Well, insects have been around for 50 million years or so, 50 to 60 million years from the Cretaceous period. And insects probably a million years ago, disappointingly, were probably not as different as what we see today. But if you go back to late Cretaceous period, when you had a higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere, insects were much bigger. So famously, Meganeura is this giant dragonfly that's has a wingspan of 3 feet across, or a meter across or so. And what's interesting is so why was everything bigger back then? Well, you had more oxygen in the atmosphere. Insects don't have lungs. They have basically a system of trachea, these tubes that go throughout their body. They still need to get oxygen in there because oxygen basically is the fuel, and blood, or hemolymph in the case of insects, what they use to transport oxygen throughout the body for metabolism. So if you have these spiracles, which are these little openings all over the insect body, and you can probably find some on the ant here. Usually they typically show up on the thorax and the abdomen. These are the openings, and the oxygen has to diffuse through the trachea to get to the different parts of the insect. Well, if the insect is very big, then the oxygen has a harder time diffusing into the insect. The insect can move its body like it does when it's in wing muscles and contracts its thorax and that kind of stuff, which in a way can it's not exactly lungs, but kind of like lungs in a way. But still, it's up to simple diffusion for the oxygen to get throughout the body. So when you have more oxygen in the atmosphere, you have a bigger insect. It can support bigger insects. As we have less oxygen in the atmosphere, it's not a critical point, we're not all going to suffocate tomorrow or anything like that, But what it means is that for organisms like insects that don't have lungs, they're going to tend to end up being a bit smaller. So hopefully that's the answer to your question. But I think 1,000,000 years ago, an insect time is not that long, because insects, I believe, predate the dinosaurs. I think wasps and ants diverged, I think, about late Cretaceous period. So I think that was, I'm not a super knowledgeable about my different eras, but I think that was like 50 or 60 million years ago. There's a species that was found in amber in the shores of New Jersey by this couple, married couple, and they're amateur paleontologists and entomologists. So they were actually looking for something like this, and they found the amber with Sphecomyrma, the so-called missing link between ants and wasps. They sent it to E.O. Wilson for him to check out. He was at Harvard, and the story goes he got it in the mail and opened it up and immediately dropped it on the ground, and it shattered the amber. But luckily it shattered in a way that didn't harm the actual original insect. But talk about, big mistake. E.O. Wilson has a lot of great stories. He's a really good scientist. I mean, he passed away a few years ago. I was very fortunate in the fact that I got to meet him. But if you're looking for like a good scientist who writes a lot of really interesting books and is also generally an all-around nice guy, he's a great one. He has a lot of great videos out, and very interesting dude. People who know E.O. Wilson tend to really love him, except for Richard Dawkins. Because he's just a really lovable dude. His writing is really inspiring too. I highly recommend it. I mean, he writes not just on ants, but also he has philosophical musings, and that kind of thing. If you've had enough of Neil deGrasse Tyson, look up E.O. Wilson. It's a nice break from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Cool. I'm glad you enjoyed hanging out. I'm gonna about 10 minutes. I'm gonna finish this up for today. Thanks for the great questions and the conversation. I really enjoy it. I'm falling behind in my reading of insects, but books are like the best way to get all this knowledge. It tends to stick better. Stick bugs. There's another good crazy adaptation. I do have a YouTube channel where I go through various ZBrush tutorials. They're not all bug related, but they are all ZBrush related. I'll be adding some more to them this week. We start working on doing more stuff on the iPad. So just, I've been using ZBrush on the iPad since it was in beta. I really like it. But I just got a little detachable keyboard for my iPad, and now that makes ZBrush really great on the iPad because you can use all the hotkeys. So now it's a lot more like using ZBrush on the desktop, but with the added advantage that it's totally portable. So I can hang out, watch TV, and sculpt and that kind of thing, or go someplace and sculpt. And the keyboard's really cool. And they're not very expensive. Let me see this real quick. I think somebody's typing their AI prompts into the chat here for some reason. I will, when I get to that point, I'll show how I do poly painting. I have also done a lot of demos of poly painting on my, if you want to look at previous episodes of my live stream, I've done poly painting for like this guy and also this one from beginning to end, and then this one. But yeah, when I get to it, the ant is, you know, it's more subtle in terms of the colors than some of the other bugs that I've done. But I've done a fair amount of texturing of ants before. I tend to basically do my poly painting in ZBrush, so I'll paint my my color diffuse maps in ZBrush, and then send everything over to Substance and do all the other maps in Substance. And of course, bake out the normals in Substance based on my high and low in here. So it's looking pretty good. And do this side a little bit. I think what I'll do next week is the mandibles and the mouth parts, and the other and the antenna. That shouldn't take quite as long. I was a little bit slow today because I was kind of talking a lot. So normally I do this much quicker. And then what I'd probably do, I'm going to finish this a little bit more later, but just to sort of show what I would do after this step of just refining some of this detail. This is where surface noise comes in really handy. If I go down here to surface and turn on noise. Not crazy about this interface. Play with the scale a little bit in the graph and just come up with something that kind of breaks it up and makes it look a little bit more interesting. Something like this. So this noise is currently just projected onto the surface. So there's a couple things you could do with this noise. You could just simply say, okay, apply to mesh, and then that's going to add the noise to the mesh. That's pretty good. It's a little bit kind of like overall the same strength, so that tends to look a little CG. Another thing you could do, I just did Control Z to undo that, so now we're just back in the projection phase, is you could do mask by noise, and then maybe like, I could do like, you know, hide the mask and invert it or whatever, and then go over with like the inflate brush, and this way I can kind of like dial that noise in. Oops. In more specific spots, which could look, it takes more time, but it looks more interesting, you know, because now I have variation, can hold the Alt key, can dig in, look at these parts, release the Alt key, and this can look a little bit more interesting, especially if you want to do it stronger in very specific places. So that's something I'll probably do once I finish kind of the larger details. But I use surface noise a lot for this kind of stuff. But you can see how kind of helps to make this look less like it's drawn on and more like organic part of the surface. And then of course, then when you bake out your maps and throw a nice material on this and specular highlights and roughness, then it starts to really look realistic. And also I'll use this, I'll do all my detailing before I do poly painting, because then when I use poly painting, I could use various different types of mask based on the details to make the poly paint more interesting and more subtle. You can sculpt and paint textures at the same time if you want to. There's no reason, there's nothing to stop you from doing that. I just prefer to do the textures differently. Basically, the way you do that is, let's say I'll go into skin shader, so I don't have blue, and let's say take I don't know, say clay, and then turn on RGB, right? And then choose a different color. We'll go down here to poly paint, and maybe I do like, you know, color, fill object with this red, and maybe invert the mask, hide it, fill it with like a little orange, right? Maybe lower the RGB intensity. You know, just to have like a base color on there of something to work with. And then I still have that mask applied. I can lower the RGB level and sculpt and basically paint at the same time for poly paint. But I generally don't like to do that because I like to see the details that I'm sculpting. I think the paint for me is a little bit too confusing. I'd rather see it afterwards. But it is possible to paint and sculpt at the same time. My brain just wants to think of forms first and then textures later. You know, and if you get into substance, of course, there can be, you know, depending on how you're doing your layers and all that kind of stuff, and noise and stuff, it's kind of like sculpting and painting at the same time too. Stop sculpting, AI can do better. No, it can't. I'm glad you brought that up, so I'll finish today on why you're wrong. First of all, AI doesn't enjoy sculpting, and I enjoy sculpting, so that right there is reason enough to do it. There's plenty of YouTube videos devoted to people doing crafty stuff with their hands. They don't have to do it, but they do it anyways. Why? Because they enjoy doing it. But if I go to YouTube, so I was showing this last week, and I'll look up entomology animated. Okay. So, here is my channel on YouTube. One of my channels. I have two channels. This is Entomology Animated. These are the animations that I've created that I spent a long time working on making sure that they were accurate and gave good information. Here, down here under Shorts, I'm going to try and keep this clean, but some jerk has pumped out as many AI animations of insects as they possibly can. This is mine. This is real. This is Ant Labs. This is good stuff. But this is terrible. So this is supposed to be a mosquito. But if you take a look at it, let's take a look. There's no proboscis. Where's the insect's mouth? Where's the thing that actually sticks? Or where's the mosquito's mouth? These wings are totally wrong. That's not a mosquito is part of Diptera, meaning it has 2 wings, not 4 wings. It shouldn't have 4 wings. What the hell is going on here? This is so wrong. Everything about this is wrong, wrong, wrong. It looks cool. It'll impress somebody who doesn't know anything. It'll provide misinformation, so people have bad information. This is not the mosquito digestive system at all. So that's one of mine. That was just done for fun. But there's some other ones on here. That's real stuff. That's good stuff. All right, now we're getting into dumb stuff. But if you go to this person's channel it's filled with just bad stuff. So I have to disagree with you. Insect AI art, at least they're honest that it's AI. It looks realistic, but it's really stupid. They have animations like, here's for some reason a praying mantis has decided to save a bee from drowning. It makes absolutely zero sense. I don't know what's going on here, but none of this makes sense. This is not even the right scale. What is going on here? I have no idea. It's all terrible. It looks very realistic, but it's all wrong. That doesn't look realistic at all. So, there's my answer to your question. Stop sculpting, AI can do better. Yeah, 2-3 years, AR artist. I don't think there'll be art replaced. I'm sorry. If you've worked in the industry and you know how to work for a client, you'll see that AI will be complementary skill. It's not going to replace artists. Sorry. You can like AI, you can hate AI, but it's important to understand how it actually works. CG is always changing. Our jobs are always going to change. You just have to adapt to it. 3D coat allows you to sculpt and paint multi-channel texture at the same time. 3D coat is definitely cool. I'm very impressed with it. Haven't had time to work with it or play with it, but it's definitely way cool. And I've seen some artists do awesome things. I think 3D code is really good for concepting. That's where it really does amazing stuff. So cool, guys. Thanks for an interesting conversation. I will see you next week.